Now, when people talk about the ghosts of Suncorp Stadium or Lang Park, they're not referring to the spirit of Queensland Rugby League players who have come and gone. For today's edition of Yesterday's News, Drive's Chris Calcino helps dig up a long-buried story from beneath that hallowed turf, where the State of Origin decider will be held on Wednesday.
Brisbane's Lang Park is widely known as the place where the dreams of New South Welshmen go to curl up and die. But long before it became the Cauldron, and well before Wally Lewis stood frozen in bronze outside the gates, the sacred turf of Lang Park was a literal burial ground. Between 1843 and 1875, the 16-acre site served as a cemetery, holding the remains of thousands of early Brisbane residents. This is the story of one of them, a very controversial figure named Henry Wells, whose tale has now been exhumed by dogged detective of the distant past, Harold Peacock of the History Out There blog, even if his body never was.
Mr. Wells was born in Basingstoke, Hampshire, England in 1813. He came to the Australian colonies and lived first in Tasmania for about 20 years. He was well known there as a coach driver and a proprietor of coaches.
And it was there in Launceston where controversy and disgust first reared their heads. In 1860, a small boy was run over and killed by a coach that was driven by Mr. Wells. But it was what he did next that caused such condemnation.
When the child was run over, Mr. Wells pulled up just long enough to see the child was picked up, then went on without even seeing how the poor child was. So it was a hit and run, effectively. And Mr. Wells said he couldn't see, what good he could have done if he stopped. But nonetheless, he was a controversial figure right from the start.
But if you really wanted to stoke the fires of denunciation in the 19th century, one act was sure to cause a scandal. In Victorian-era Australia, high society divorces and salacious court cases served as the collective entertainment of the masses. Without modern screens to turn to, people devoured the daily broadsheets which printed every gritty, unedited detail of local misdeeds to satisfy the public's appetite for drama. And Wells, despite his wife and family at home, had a wandering eye.
Mr. Wells had his mind on other things. You see, he was driving coaches for a Mr. William Spearman, who was a licensee of the Union Inn in Launceston at the time, which meant that Mr. Wells was spending a fair bit of time at the inn. And it was a little too much time, it seems, because he got to know Mrs. Mary Ann Spearman rather quite well.
A little too well for her husband's liking. And with that pesky Victorian-era media being what it was, it made for excellent broadsheet fodder, and this scandalous elopement made headlines in 4 Australian colonies over 4 consecutive months.
He was really big news. Mr. Wells had a wife, family and property. He eloped with his boss's wife. And his boss, Mr. Spearman, he was so enraged that he took measures with authorities to have the pair apprehended.
And so began a sort of Bonnie and Clyde archetypal run from the law. The enraged, betrayed husband, Mr. Spearman, went straight to the authorities to hunt them down. But travelling under the assumed names of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the illicit lovers fled Launceston for Melbourne and then skipped on to Sydney.
It was in Sydney that Mr. Wells was apprehended, but strangely he was allowed out on bail. I say strangely because he promptly skipped bail and the couple continued on to Brisbane and opened a boarding house on Charlotte Street.
But the ordeal took its toll. Wells became utterly consumed by paranoia and shame, and on the 22nd of May 1861, the pressure cooker finally blew. After walking inside from the backyard, Wells spoke a few words to Mary Ann, collapsed on the sofa, and died on the spot. Now, you might expect a coroner's report to simply read heart failure and leave it at that. Not in 1861.
The verdict was that Mr. Wells had died from disease of the heart that was brought on by a nervous excitement, disgrace he had placed on his children and Mrs. Spearman, and fear of arrest preying on his mind. In other words, he died of a nervous and broken heart at the age of 48.
The following year, Mrs. Spearman's daughter came up to Queensland to bring her back home, and she promptly resumed her marriage back in Tasmania and managed the family business. After her actual husband's death, the shrewd businesswoman and bookkeeper stayed on to manage the family pub until retirement. By the time she died in 1892, the scandal of her youth had seemingly been wiped clean.
Her obituary made no mention of her elopement or of the heartbroken death of a lover. The whole romantic episode had simply been forgotten. Forgotten much like Henry Wells himself, who is still buried under the turf of Lang Park today.
Old Henry Wells's bones and DNA are now dissipated into the Lang Park turf, along with so many other dead men and women whose families didn't exhume their body when the overcrowded site was redeveloped into a recreational space. And despite being a Tasmanian by birth, Harold reckons the ghost of this roving ratbag will be flying the maroon colours during the State of Origin decider.
His heart must remain here north of the border, surely.
Harold Peacock from the History Out There blog, speaking with Chris Calcino for that rather relevant yesterday's news leading into the State of Origin decider on Wednesday.